liberalism, and what I mean by liberalism here is classical liberalism, as opposed to the liberalism that many of you will be familiar with from an American context, and I'm going to define what I mean by that more in a moment, is generally discussed by political theorists and philosophers in a very loose, grab bag sort of way. Usually discussed as a kind of economic and political theory that centers around individual liberty or individual freedom. And if it's elaborated further, is often connected to a particular political thinker, like John Locke, who spoke about life, liberty, and property, or in the 18th century, the political economist and moral philosopher Adam Smith, who talked about a liberal system or a liberal plan by which each man could pursue his own interest in his own way. The ambition of this book is to offer a historical explanation of liberalism that tries to argue that those definitions are at best inadequate and at worst misleading. So, what is a more historical definition of liberalism? And why does The Economist allow us to understand that better? So, I, in this book, argue that liberalism emerges in the early 19th century in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, when for the first time people began to call themselves liberals and to mean something like what we would understand that to mean in a political sense. At the Cortes of Cadiz in 1810, there a group of people calling themselves Liberales, as opposed to the Serviles, argue for constitutional monarchy, universal male suffrage, indirect voting, civil liberties, and things like that. The term then migrates to France after 1815 and the Bourbon Restoration after Napoleon is defeated. And there it means something like a middle political concept, somewhere between the extremes of Jacobin revolution after 1789 and ultra-monarchism and a return to the prior absolutism. So what happens in Britain, right? The concept originates on the continent of Europe and eventually migrates to Britain. There, I argue that something unique takes place. There is a synthesis between political ideas of liberalism that we see in Spain and France and economic ideas of liberalism, meaning the free market, theories of private property, and of free trade, with political theories of constitutional government, and so forth. And in the 1830s and 40s, and this is the moment out of which the magazine The Economist is founded, and it allows us to understand that moment much better, in part because its founder, James Wilson, is one of the most virulent, if you like, advocates for this theory of liberalism in its dominant form. And he is a member of the Anti-Corn Law League, which is a league of middle-class industrialists and others who push for total free trade in grain. It's a moment when the opposition to that in the Chartist movement, and I won't get into too much detail about this, the Chartist movement, which Marx and Engels called the First Proletarian Party, is defeated. And those two, the victory of the Anti-Corn Law League and the defeat of the Chartist movement is this moment in the 1840s that The Economist is founded in 1843. And so, what does The Economist allow us to see about the future progression of liberalism after that moment? So instead of basing my account around some kind of notion of individual freedom or liberty, which, as I said, I don't think actually gets at anything important about liberalism, or not the most important thing, what I argue is that The Economist allows us to see liberalism in classical form as it confronts three major developments in world history in the period after. The first is the challenge posed to liberals by the advent of a mass working class and their demands to have the right to vote. What do liberals say about this? What is their response? The second is the spread of empires. That the modal liberal state in the early 19th century was not necessarily imperial, but that imperial expansion moves apace in this period. What do liberals say about that? can a liberal state also be an imperial state, and do liberal rights apply to those colonial subjects that these empires are going to create? And third, what do liberals have to say about the rise of finance and the financialization of the global economy? The Economist, I argue, allows us to understand that process very well, based in the City of London, and bringing us the perspective of the bankers and financiers, merchants, shippers that reside in that locale. So I think maybe I've rambled enough about what I think my book is about, and I'd like to hear from Atoussa and Adam what they have to say, or if they have any questions.
Sure, I'll start. I'm not going to go off about what I thought of the book. I thought it was really interesting, and as a journalist, a very interesting also look at media and how that's evolved over the years. But I'll
share the microphone.
Oh, I'm sure you heard me. Alex, how did you start this book? I mean, first of all, I'm surprised no one had written it, which is always a sign of a good book. But how did you come to it yourself?
Yeah, so I was explaining this. I've been explaining this for many years. Many people in this room know me as a person who's writing a book about The Economist, but not as a person who publishes that book on The Economist. So, so this is you're welcome to a new era in my life and in yours. The Economist book began as an article. If you can believe it, this over 500-page book began life as an article in a small French newspaper called Le Monde Diplomatique when I was studying abroad there, basically, before I embarked on the somewhat tragic journey of graduate school. And the article became a small book. It became a dissertation. It went back to being a book. And the reason that I embarked on it was because a French editor in Paris named Serge Alimi, who runs a journal called Le Monde Diplomatique, was really enraged by The Economist. And like many others, maybe some of them in this room, had been offended by various things The Economist had said about the need for reforms in France. The idea, I mean, look, if you've been following the situation in France right now, and the clash between Emmanuel Macron, the current president, the darling of The Economist, on the cover of The Economist just a few weeks ago, in high style, and the trade unions that are calling for a general strike, you'll know that The Economist has for a long time said that the French state needs to reform itself, adapt itself to the market, to notions of neoliberalism that would suit the Anglo-Saxon perspective of the newspaper. And so he wanted me to kind of expose and attack and criticize The Economist, and also to try and understand it better. But that little piece ended up being something much bigger.
It has, Alice, what part of the reason why you wanted to write the book? Because presumably The Economist has huge sway. I mean, the figures you cite in the book are extraordinary. I mean, the circulation is crazily enormous, even in the United States. Can you remember? It outsells the New York Times and all sorts of publications that you might think of as being more influential. Do I remember that right?
Yeah, I mean, nowadays The Economist is a huge business, and it has a huge circulation. And in the U.S. it sells over 800,000 copies. It has a circulation of over 800,000, more than in its home market of Britain. But even when The Economist didn't sell many copies, one editor during the Second World War said, "Never has so much been read by so few for so long," riffing on Winston Churchill. Even when not many people read it, and maybe even more so when not many people read it, its influence was absolutely enormous. And that is partly because the editors themselves, and each chapter is organized by editor, ended up being these conduits between, on the one hand, the City of London and financial capital, and on the other, the state. The first editor, James Wilson, there's only about 3,000, readers of The Economist in the first, 20, 30 years of the newspaper, ends up playing a hugely important role. He advises the government on the policies it should follow in the Irish famine. He's sent out to India as the first Chancellor of the Indian Exchequer to basically force the Indians to pay for the cost of repressing them during the Indian Mutiny. I mean, he was also a theorist of political economy, an advocate for the banking school, and so much else. But I think that one way of answering that question is to say that the editors themselves have played this extraordinary role.
Your description of liberalism is in many ways what we'd now say, oh, that's status quo, that's, kind of standard issue. Privatization and reforms and all of the stuff that Halimi got angry about in France. This is prescriptions that you would see in many countries, in many contexts. It wasn't always that way, though. They were not always the center. How do you think this magazine got to the point where they were wielding so much power? I mean, how did that build over time, and how did they become central to the status quo?
That's a great question. One editor described the position of The Economist as the extreme center. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about the center of politics in our own time. As many people, including former President Obama, warns the Democratic Party not to move too far to the left, I think we can question whether or not the center is always so moderate, right? If it calls for further austerity, is that so moderate, and so forth. I mean, even the IMF is calling for a loosening of the fiscal purse strings, and so, but this is, anyway. So I think that it embodies this kind of extreme centrist philosophy, which is not so moderate, and especially at the foundation of the magazine, was calling for a real transformation of society. Karl Polanyi, the well-known sociologist, described the advent of laissez-faire, and The Economist in its early iteration is sort of the embodiment of laissez-faire in economics. He describes this process as, he says, laissez-faire was planned, planning wasn't. So The Economist is a campaigning newspaper. It is designed to bring about a different set of social relations, to make people act as liberal subjects, when they might not want to. I mean, I could go on further, but if you have a thought.
Yeah, but to that point, so was this a magazine that had the conceit of having a view from nowhere, the same way that the New York Times, say, would today? Or was it always an explicit goal of reshaping society?
Do you mean the voice of the paper? Is this, well, I think both, right? I mean, one of the anecdotes in the introduction that you can look forward to after you buy the book, which I'll be selling. Oh, I won't personally sell. No, I'm just kidding. It's. One of the anecdotes in the introduction that I liked very much from an editor at The Economist was when a staff person just joins the paper, young person, doesn't know how to write in the voice of The Economist. I mean, those of you who read The Economist not necessarily enjoy this book, but those of you who do will know that one of the distinguishing things about The Economist is that it has no bylines, right? It is written as The Economist, by The Economist. A young person comes to the office and says, well, how do I write like The Economist? And an older Oxbridge type fellow turns to him and says, oh, it's simple, pretend you're God. And so this voice on high actually, I think, is particularly effective at bestowing advice on, and again, if you read The Economist, you'll know that, presidents, prime ministers, dictators, and so on are told quite, explicitly, these are the three things you need to do to reform your economy. These are the three things you need to do to bring transparency to markets in your, and so on. And so I think that is part of the secret of The Economist, is that it speaks with immense authority, and that is both a kind of style that it has, that many Americans, I think, find particularly charming, but also it's kind of earned, because they do have the ear of the powerful and of the wealthy.
I was really struck by the style of your book, because it's a real pleasure to read. This is like my shameless plug for the book. Really, it's fantastically good reading. If you know Alex in person, you'll know that he's an extraordinarily funny guy in this wry, self-deprecating way that we're seeing too much of right now as well. And the book has some of a flavour of that, but then the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the incredible challenge of writing this book, because the house style of The Economist is not, it is the voice of God, but if it's a God, he's flippant, facetious, excessive, quite funny in his own silly English Oxbridge senior common room kind of way. The closest equivalent in the US, I was trying to think of this, it's as though you had sat down to write a book about the New Yorker. And that's a non-trivial challenge, like finding the style in which to write a book about the New Yorker. How do you not end up as the dopey, dry, pointless academic who's just sort of finding some kind of angle on an object which is incredibly highly polished, right? I mean, the Economist, you talk about the struggles over style, over writing, the writing styles of the people that you're writing about very explicitly. But I felt one of the things I was most impressed by was that you had found your own, you had found a voice which didn't replicate that, was not slavish, and yet was incredibly compelling and authoritative. Were you conscious of this? I know you have described it as a challenge, and it's obviously taken a while, but were you conscious of this stylistic, no, that's like, you know, books can take a long time. Were you conscious of that difficulty of finding your own language that was not that, because you succeeded?
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think that there were times when I was worried that I was simply repeating what The Economist was saying, because part of the challenge of the book was to construct a narrative about liberalism that didn't reproduce the standard version of liberalism, in which it's just a kind of eclectic mixture of ideas and a list of things that the West has done that are good, you know? And that's certainly the way The Economist sees its brand of liberalism, you know, as, you know, sort of, yeah, they're right. Now, it helped that I don't share The Economist's worldview. But that too was a challenge, to not write a book that was right, that was not a denunciation, or that, you know, wasn't preachy. I mean, ideally, I wanted people who consider themselves proudly to be liberals to be able to read the book and to enjoy it and to take something from it, and without feeling that I had sort of, you know, told them how naughty they'd been for the last 175 years, although they have been naughty. Or maybe that's not the right word, but, you know, whatever. You know, I think it at certain points in the book, there were challenges where I was so incensed by things that I was reading that a bit of snark began to creep in. So towards the end of the book, the chapters on globalization, this is the moment when The Economist is really hitting its stride under Bill Emmett and John Micklethwaite, just before the financial crisis of 2008. And, you know, they're really summoning the shades of The Economist past, of James Wilson and the laissez-faire kind of, you know, it's like, you know, no regulations for child labor in the third world. That would be doing a disservice to, you know, the Bangladeshi girl that we've pictured on this week's Economist. And, you know, the WTO protesters are selfish, the anti-WTO protesters are selfish, and that kind of thing. And, you know, yeah, there were moments where, but then I realized that I could just, there's actually a string of books that the last editor before the current one, Zenny Minton Beddoes, this guy John Micklethwaite, actually the head of Bloomberg now, who's been instructed not to publish articles about Bloomberg, I guess, during the presidential campaign, where, you know, him and his writing partner, this guy Adrian Wooldridge, who currently writes the Badgett column for The Economist, there's some really out there stuff about sort of poverty and joblessness and the effects of globalization on industrial, you know, unemployment rates in the Midwest, and it's sort of, well, this is just creative destruction. All that. Anyway, so I'm just saying that there were various challenges. One was not to reproduce the voice of The Economist slavishly. The other was not to descend into snark when I sometimes felt like I wanted to.
Were there any positive? I mean, to me, as a survivor of a certain sort of Cambridge senior common room culture and an escapee from it, I thought that you nailed it very accurately. But I think, I was reminded of Le Carré, to be honest, like a sort of very downbeat, slightly noir rendition of this journalistic scene, because they're on the Strand, they're not in Fleet Street, right? So it's not the sort of dregs of London journalistic society, but these are pretty hard-living people in part. But I mean, can you give us more of a flavour of because one of the really striking things about the book is the sociology of British journalism, or this transatlantic journalism that you conjure up. It's kind of in the loop a little bit. You know, it has that kind of feel of the transatlantic relationship as, in part, satire as well.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Yeah, I mean, The Economist has sometimes been described as a senior common room, at Oxford and Cambridge, and most of the graduates of The Economist are from Oxford and Cambridge. In fact, during the 1990s and early 2000s, so many of the Economist journalists came from just one college at Oxford called Magdalen College, that it was called the Magdalen Mafia. And, in the race to succeed one of the editors, it was said, don't worry, she just went to Wadham, right? She doesn't stand a chance of succeeding to become the editor. And so, yeah, there is this kind of, in a way, there were moments where it felt like the book was a portrait of the British ruling class, of which the just re-elected Prime Minister Boris Johnson is a representative example, a graduate of Eton, a member of he was a journalist by trade and said many wild things that didn't in the slightest stand in his way during the election. But yeah, there is a kind of louche, cigarette smoking, Smiley's people sort of thing, although it's most pronounced in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And during that era of The Economist, you have Kim Philby, one of the members of the Cambridge Five, for those of you who are into spies, is sending dispatches from Beirut. And there's a scene where he's playing with foxes, and he's not submitting enough reports. Of course, he's filing very nice reactionary pieces that he thinks will chime with the prejudices of the British ruling classes, and then all of a sudden he stops sending reports, and it's because he's defected to Moscow, because they've found him out. So he's not the only spy in the book. There are a lot of people who have used The Economist, British journalists who have used The Economist as the perfect alibi for submitting foreign reports from abroad. It's a good cover, and so part of the book is about that too. It's about these kind of MI6 types who might be stationed in the Middle East and sending back reports from there, or a kind of group of transatlantic journalists. So in the post-war period, lots of editors spend a period of time in New York or in Washington, D.C., and in a certain sense, the second half of the book kind of discusses the way that the special relationship between Britain and the United States actually functions on a journalistic or ideological level, that these people are kind of trained, they're given fellowships after Oxford or Cambridge, they come to the US, they see how government works in DC, or they see how Wall Street works in New York, and then they come back to London to write pieces extolling the virtues of the United States, of its form of political economy, or of its sort of hegemony in the world. And so it's a kind of practical discussion of how that actually happens.
So I want to go back to something you briefly mentioned and didn't get into, and that's the naughty things that some of The Economist's writers and editors have advocated over the years. This is a two-part question. So maybe give me the top 5 naughty things.
Okay, well, as you can tell, my answers sometimes trail off into incoherence, but one of my favorite naughty, it's not right to call it naughty, but it's not right to call it my favorite. Nothing about this is right. One of the most remarkable characters in the book, two, a guy named Brian Crozier and a guy named Robert Moss, who are deeply embedded in the British intelligence services, and indeed a number of Western intelligence agencies. And they are some of the most sinister and kind of almost demented figures. I mean, it sort of was interesting doing the research in that section, because you realize that the Cold War produced these absolutely unique figures that you know, sort of, you know, if you had anti-communism to sell, you could hawk your wares, you know, despite some pretty out there kind of behavioral tics, let's say. Robert Moss is I mean, there's so many episodes. He ends up, I mean, he's deeply committed to fighting the Cold War. He's a protege of this guy, Brian Crozier. He eventually leaves The Economist to publish a set of erotic spy thrillers. One is called The Spike, and it involves an alter ego of his named Hockney, who starts out life as a sort of groovy guy in Berkeley, kind of anti-war demonstrator, but then realizes that there's lots of KGB moles implanted everywhere in the US and British media, who are trying to sap the resolve of Western peoples to fight communism till the bitter, bitter end. And there's, you know, there's a lot more I could talk about with that, but one episode that is indicative of Robert Moss's habitus, if you will, is basically, he becomes sort of a proxy for the CIA in Chile, and he writes articles in The Economist and in a connected journal called Foreign Report to prepare public opinion in the West for Allende's ouster. This is a 3-year-long campaign. Moss is posted to Santiago. He files, you know, reports that begin with him drinking pisco sour. What's the pisco sour? I don't know. It's not my cocktail. But he's filing reports from hotel lobbies and basically discussing, you know, in as much detail as possible, the attempts to sabotage Allende by, you know, funding, you know, the truck driver strike or all sorts of other activities. He writes a book called Chile's Marxist Experiment, which is designed to justify the coup in Chile. The Chilean embassy after the coup, after Pinochet's coup, buys 10,000 copies of the book because they're so excited about it. But actually there's a problem because the book comes out before the book comes out, it's too late, the book comes out after the coup. But when Moss, who is sharing an office at the Economist Tower with Andrew Knight, who goes on to become editor, so it's not like he's a marginal figure, when he hears that Allende has shot himself with a gun provided by Castro as the Moneda Palace is under siege, dances down the corridors of the Economist office chanting, "My enemy is dead." Was my timing off? No? So, I mean, just, I don't know, I feel bad now. I mean, I obviously am horrified by this. It's just that I think it's a particularly apt illustration of the lengths that The Economist goes during the Cold War to do these things and the kinds of personalities that it so that's, sorry, you asked for 5 and I just gave you 1 in an incredibly long story, but that and there are many others, but that is one that I think is illustrative.
Yeah, so personally, I'm kind of jealous because I work for a magazine. We publish like 3 bad takes on Russia and forever, you know, tarnished by this. The Economist seems to be a bit like Teflon in that regard. They support a lot of pretty bad shit that is, you know, provably bad, and yet they don't seem to pay the consequences. Why is that? That's fascinating to me.
Well, maybe Adam has opinions about this too. I don't know, or you do, but I mean, I guess my book argues that the imperial project empire is you know, it's essential to what liberalism is. That it's, you know, far from being an aberration or an outlier, that it somehow structures liberals' relationship to the world. So I think that, you know, the Economist has a way of advocating regime change in faraway countries that sounds very nice. And is there, you know, I think liberals in general, insofar as The Economist is representative of them, and, you know, there are many different kinds of liberals, so don't be offended if you are one, or not this kind. But you know, they have a way of euphemizing things that are pretty awful, and, you know, in the post-war period, you know, I talk about various things that they advocate, you know. So, for example, I spoke about Robert Moss and his role in preparing Western opinion for the coup in Chile, but there are other examples of this. Brian Beedham, the foreign correspondent, the foreign affairs editor at The Economist in the post-war period, does the same for Indonesia and in Sukarno, basically making it clear that he is just a communist puppet, he should be removed, and of course in 1965 he is, and 500,000 communists and suspected communists are killed. And this is, a real horrific thing to have endorsed, and they do. And they go on talking about how effective Suharto, his replacement, is at promoting economic growth, at bringing necessary reforms. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question head on, but it seems to me that they can get away with it because the role of Western interventions and of these sort of what we're calling naughty things is so fundamental to the operations of global capitalism, and that's what The Economist is sort of talking about.
I'd like to, at the risk of taking us into deeper and more serious water, I would like to press on this point in a variety of different ways. I mean, one of them is the nature of your critique. Is the nature of your, it seems to me there's at least three different ways this could go in, so this is going to be a bit sprawling as well, and you choose which way you go at it. So one is the significance of the euphemism that you refer to. Clearly it is one of liberalism's constitutive weaknesses, is that it tends to euphemism. Ideologically, of course, that serves a function, but it exposes it to a certain hard-nosed critique, either from the right, say Carl Schmitt, or from the left, classically somebody like Lenin. And the euphemisms, the hypocrisy of liberalism are just a sitting duck for that kind of critique. Now, liberalism can formulate a defense of that kind of euphemism. Say, David Runciman has done quite an interesting job, I think, in playing up, as it were, the choices between hypocrisy on the one hand and cynicism on the other. And he argues and makes a pretty concerted argument for hypocrisy. If you're going to have a vice politically, rather it be hypocrisy than cynicism. So it would be great to get your take on that aspect, because as you say, The Economist is one of the great fountainheads of liberal euphemism. Another question in a similar vein is your argument that the liberalism that you see in The Economist is peculiar in the mistakes, the grotesque judgments it makes across the period of the 19th and 20th century? So are you arguing that, as it were, liberalism, which this newspaper exemplifies, is peculiarly at risk of making those kind of errors, as opposed to, say, the other great political traditions that come out of the 19th century? So let's just make it simple: socialism, Marxism, or conservatism on the other hand, right? So is the claim that liberalism is peculiar, or are you saying, by way of your study of The Economist, here's one of the great traditions that comes out of the 19th century, and these are the disastrous misjudgments which a particular group of liberals fell into? Not consistently along the line, in your view, I think they took an honourable position in 1914, but see what I'm saying? Is the claim that liberalism has a particular tendency to get it wrong, or is this just an illustration of how all 19th century ideologies were challenged by the 20th century, or by the challenges of the late 20th century? The third, more defensive position, most defensive reaction I had, as somebody who self-identifies as a left liberal, is, you know what, these are just terrible liberals. I mean, the people in this book are the reason I can't live in England and don't want to live in England. I mean, I'll take an American liberal over these people any day. They are conspicuously they're disasters waiting to happen, all of them. From the point of view of their sociology, their personality, their makeup, their self-presentation, you wouldn't trust any of these people to do anything. They are flippant products of an English private school or grammar school education, determined to be smart at all costs, and then with some doctrine. And of course, the results are catastrophic. Does that tell me very much about liberalism? I don't know. I cannot, in any way, after reading your book, deny the force of your argument that this is really actually existing liberalism. That you have nailed us all to the wall on forever after. No one will be able to escape the force of your point. But it just causes you to think these people shouldn't be trusted, shouldn't be allowed to describe themselves. You see what I mean? So there's these three different levels. One is this a constitutive vice that liberalism can own and navigate its way around, do we have to acknowledge that liberalism is peculiarly bad in its political judgment? Or could we simply address this particular instance, which is an undeniably important instance, as a particularly bad one?
Okay, those are great questions. Let's see how I do. So, cynicism versus hypocrisy. Okay, so yeah, this is I've heard another political a historian of political theory named Jennifer Pitts argue that it's not cynicism and it's not hypocrisy, but it's a blind spot. There's a consistent blind spot when it comes to empire. So someone like John Stuart Mill, who in many ways is an admirable liberal. Why is he an admirable liberal? Because a year after he publishes his treatise on political economy, he acknowledges the force of socialism and begins to call himself a socialist. There's no better liberal than that. No, I'm kidding. No, I don't know why I said that. I am not. But what about Mill? Of course, in most sort of accounts of him, his attitudes towards empire are completely sanitized, and there's no getting around it. He was, he worked for the East India Company. He justified British imperial rule in India, and not only in India, but in Ireland, where he spoke about the need to repress the Fenian movement and the movement for home rule and Irish nationalism. And, so to me, do liberals sometimes make arguments for empire in bad faith? Yes, they do in this book. Sometimes there's a kind of knowing hypocrisy about what's at work, and I think that's where the intelligence agents that are in this book feature. So a Brian Crozier or a Robert Moss, who sort of know very well that the figures that they're telling, that they're saying should be shot, like Patrice Lumumba, aren't Soviet agents, but that, this needs to happen. And so I'm going to say what I need to say. Okay, so I think that's one way of addressing it. In terms of liberalism,
is it peculiarly bad?
Is it peculiarly bad on empire?
Well, peculiarly bad in its judgments.
In its judgments in general. Well,
is that the claim?
No, I take a more cold analytic view of it, in the sense that, liberals built the modern world in some sense. We live in the world that they created, and from their perspective, the things that they advocated were absolutely necessary. I mean, I don't see how you could, one of the arguments that my book narrates is this kind of falling out. Early liberals in the early 19th century basically argue that peace, free trade, and goodwill go together, right? Free trade will bring about a peaceful world. Right? In contrast to the kind of aristocratic rivalries of the early modern period, the good bourgeois are going to see to it that merchants and traders are going to bring about a peaceful world. But a few years into this operation, The Economist, they have a terrible falling out, because James Wilson realizes that, actually the Crimean War might be necessary in order to spread free trade and and liberal values. And
the Crimean War is the war between Turkey, Britain, and France on the one side, and the Russians on the other.
Yeah. So yes. Yeah, that's the Crimean War, but then also the Opium War in China in 1856. This is a war in which Britain fights to open Chinese markets. And what is it they want to sell to them? Indian opium. So I'm just saying that to me, these are what create the world market. These wars are what create the world market. And so there's a kind of realism about the Economist's version of liberalism that actually is a little less heinous than other versions of it, because it at least is quite upfront about it. I mean, they just have an article during the Crimean War where they say, after the Opium War, they say, well, wars are not pleasant, but one cannot deny that certain advantages accrue in their aftermath. So I mean, I don't know if that totally answers your question. I mean, it doesn't, but...
Well, it set me off, because one of the most alarming passages that you could read in Frederick Engels in 1848, 1849, you know this stuff, I don't need to tell you it, mid-century moment, mid-19th century moment, and reading your stuff about the way in which The Economist in the 1850s becomes the advocate for a kind of liberal campaign against reactionary Russia, You can't, to my mind, read that and not be reminded of Engels' essays in 1848, 1849 from a much more radical perspective, arguing the same case. In other words, that revolutionary Germany and revolutionary France, as soon as they have revolutionary governments, need to embark on a project of liberating Europe from the knout of Tsarist Russia, which is the force which underwrites conservatism throughout Europe. So this led me to, and Engels makes this case in extraordinarily racialized terms. In other words, he says there are not just racist states, there are racist peoples. The Slav people will have to be eradicated so as to free the Magyars and the Germans from the counter-reaction, right? Now, this goes to my question about, are liberals the only people who make terrible judgments and terrible errors of judgment? And it seems to me, even if you take just that one instance, right, what you can see is a kind of parallelism, a common indebtedness of various brands of politics, from the centre all the way through to the left. The only people who are concertedly arguing against war at that moment are die-hard reactionary conservatives. So that was the force of this. My second question is like, and it's a completely open one. Is your claim simply a limited one? Here are the, as it were, the naughtinesses that liberalism engages in, or is there a claim? I think your answer to this now is they matter more because they have power. Whereas Frederick Engels, of course, didn't get to realise his plan of a revolutionary war of liberation.
I think that. No, liberals aren't the only people that make horrific political mistakes, and the history of the 20th century is full of mistakes that Marxists and Maoists and others make. So no, it's just that in the West, where liberalism is so celebrated and so canonical and so forth, it is uniquely responsible for these crimes that it entirely disavows and eliminates from its history, whereas it's impossible to do this. I mean, that's part of the reason that I talk about actually existing liberalism, to kind of needle liberals, liberals who described Eastern socialism, as actually existing. So that there's a kind of a need to come to terms with this, and a parallelism which proceeds from precisely the opposite of your point, which is a good one. It's just that is Marxists, or so-called Marxists, have a lot to answer for in the 20th century, but liberals have never had to answer those questions, and that is because they are victorious and have never ceased to be victorious. And one of the things about the election that just happened in Britain was a sense that 10 years after the economic crisis, when it seems as though these liberal nostrums we've been forced to live by are no longer credible. People don't accept that belt tightening, is a necessity if we are to see ourselves out of this crisis. And one of the things that hurts about it, I mean, there are a number of things from my perspective personally, is that this kind of this ideology that no longer can command positive forms of adherence in the way that it might have under someone like Thatcher or Reagan, lives on. It cannot. It seems so difficult to get rid of, and so I think that part of the force of my argument, or the reason that I spent so much time talking about liberalism's errors, faults of judgment, interactions with the third world, is because it seems to me that it isn't part of the historical record. Which I know you're not saying that you don't agree in that sense. It's just so that's one of the things. And then, point about bad liberals. Are these just bad liberals? Well, no. I think what I'm trying to say is that the version of liberalism that The Economist embodies is the dominant form of liberalism, right? There are other forms of liberalism, more or less reprehensible, from kind of libertarian right all the way to the left. And, there are figures like John Stuart Mill or Bertrand Russell or J.A. Hobson and many others who embody different variants and strands of liberalism. And, one of the editors, Francis Hurst, who opposes the First World War, is a kind of Cobdenite liberal who actually has a moment where he can kind of break through the hard crust of imperialism that The Economist, I argue, embodies. But what I think about The Economist is that it is the dominant form around which all other forms of liberalism are forced to sort of gravitate, like in a solar system of some kind.
So something that The Economist has always done is market itself as some kind of aspirational. It's pretty clear in its advertising, in the demographics that it shares with people. you imagine a businessman, usually on a plane, sort of half reading it. I was wondering how this strategy, this kind of marketing, has changed since these elections, that seemingly would be, I don't know, maybe not a good look for The Economist and the things that they predicted and celebrated over the past 100 and some years.
You mean how has The Economist marketed itself differently, or?
Was 2016 good for The Economist in that people kind of came back to it with a force and said, well, yes, we repudiate Trump, and maybe Bolsonaro has some good ideas, but yes, he's kind of nasty. Like, how did that message resonate with a post-2016 audience?
Yeah, I mean, well, The Economist claims that it's doing great, and there are signs that it is managing to acquire new readers online. That's its kind of big push, to capture millennials' attention spans, and the new editor wants to sort of bring more women into the readership of The Economist. This is an overwhelmingly male-dominated kind of readership. And I think, if you've been walking around the city, you may have seen, at least I get a lot of text messages from my friends who know that I'm writing a book on The Economist, these red trucks that are selling civet feces, coffee, or trying to get you to buy grasshopper hamburgers, or, this is a kind of, innovation. I mean, since the new editors, Annie Minton-Beddoes, took up the helm, I'd say that there's been a kind of a shift away from some of the kind of disastrous promotion of third world dictators and genocidaires to one that emphasizes the kind of technological horizon of capitalism. We're going to innovate our way out of the climate crisis. We're going to look at these tiny little machines that are going to print three-dimensional water filtration systems in the third world. And I would say that, and it's no coincidence to me that this is happening at a moment where actually capitalism isn't doing too great. The productivity is stagnant, wages are stagnant. Capitalists don't seem to want to invest in productive activities. They rather speculate on the stock market, and The Economist, sort of in its back pages, routinely endorses that. Stockholder capitalism is great. We're going to hold these people to account, and I could go into more detail, but so I think the way that I end the book, the way the narrative kind of comes to a conclusion, is that since 2008, The Economist, since 2015, The Economist has endured a number of shocks. It didn't want Trump elected, right? I mean, maybe that's no surprise. Didn't want Trump elected, didn't want Brexit to happen, big fans of Renzi in Italy as a reformist. They got Macron right in the sense that they wanted him to win and predicted he would win, and he did. But it's been a period where The Economist's predictive capacities have been tested. And their answers to what ails capitalism and their attempt to address the crisis of liberalism have, in my view, been wanting, not very inspiring. And their answers to Brexit have not been very inspiring. What they will make of I haven't read the latest issue, but of course they endorsed the Liberal Democrats in the election that just happened in Britain, and they did not do very well. And Joe Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who when asked if she would press the nuclear button, answered without hesitation, yes. Which is what you want in a leader. She lost her seat. So it's not clear that the center is very healthy or that the center can hold. And it doesn't seem to me like what happened in Britain indicates that. So this is a kind of meandering answer to your question, but I think The Economist faces some problems.
We should at some point go out to the audience for questions. Maybe if you take that as a cue to start thinking of questions to ask. We'll go back and forth here for a few more minutes, but we should do that. In a sense, that problem of The Economist no longer representing the centre ground, the absolutely hegemonic position of British liberalism and British liberalism's hegemony ends not now and not in the last 10 years, but in the interval period, in the 1920s and 1930s. And you make a very interesting observation that the ideas of the new liberalism of the pre-1914 period go totally mainstream, but politically speaking, the British Liberal Party is dead from the 1920s onwards, and the latest election is just the confirmation of a century-old fact. And so The Economist from that moment onwards is, as it were, representing what is essentially a minority position in the party political spectrum and navigating. And classically, the figure that is associated with that liminal and yet central position of liberalism in Britain, if there was a figure to set against The Economist, it would be John Maynard Keynes, who you avoided in your list of good liberals earlier on. And I was curious about how you see the figure of Keynes. You have a fantastic chapter about his debates with The Economist. In some sense, to me, that is the acid test of where The Economist drifts into a politics that I personally find incredibly uncomfortable, and Keynes marks that line, and the figure of Keynes is that marker. I think it's one of the most original, it's one of the many original moments in the book, really, this discussion.
So the chapter on the 1920s and 30s, what it narrates in a way is that liberalism as a liberal, embodied as in the Liberal Party in Britain, which had dominated 19th century politics in Britain, vanishes. It's replaced by a dichotomy between Labour and Conservatives, which has lasted to this day, even if Labour didn't do very well. It's still the main opposition party. And the figure of Keynes is really important to that chapter. There's a famous passage in Keynes's The Consequences of the Peace, his book about the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, in which he describes what it was like for a liberal in the pre-war period to wake up in the morning, in bed, sipping tea, looking at the newspaper, seeing what he might order from whatever part of the world he wanted, seeing what place he might like to travel without any need for a passport, knowing that the money in his pocket is worth the same anywhere because of the gold standard. It's this kind of, it's a famous line, and I argue in that chapter that the newspaper that Keynes is reading is The Economist, and that Keynes is kind of the ideal economist reader, and he sees himself that way. He is, classmates with the editor in the 1920s, Walter Leighton. They're trained by the same guy, Marshall, hugely influential economist in Britain. And so I wanted that chapter to be this kind of narration of a conflict between, two sides of Keynes. The side that looked to the pre-1914 world of stability, of liberal certainties, and was nostalgic for it. And the Keynes that in the 1920s and 30s, as the Depression arrives, as mass unemployment arrives, as hot capital travels all around the world, destabilizing governments and leading some to put up tariff barriers, and you know very well what I'm talking about.
But it drives the finance element of liberalism's contradictions to the foreground, doesn't it?
Right, and so, one of the things I wanted to do, and, is Robert Skidelsky writes an amazing biography of Keynes. It's an absolute masterpiece, and Keynes is a very attractive figure historically, a humane, a deeply humane kind of and fascinating person. But what I wanted to do that I think Skidelsky doesn't do is to talk about the way that Keynes, despite, no matter how innovative his thinking was, and it was, in sort of articulating the problems with classical 19th century liberalism, he still remained beholden to a certain idea of the importance of finance within the British sort of political economy and the world economy, and a kind of a sense of British empire as something that should be defended, and that he looked to in the 1930s and 40s, that structured his actual arguments about what Britain should do. And there's a famous line for those of you who've made it all the way through the general theory in the last chapter, where he talks about the euthanization of the rentier, right? Keynes is often presented as someone who was deeply antagonistic towards finance, and came to this conclusion by the general theory that really what needed to happen was the rentier needed to be kind of taken out, and we needed to socialize investment. In other words, investment couldn't be left to the capitalists who weren't investing, and that was one of the reasons that aggregate demand was sort of so inadequate. But if you look at his arguments with The Economist, you realize that he was quite inconsistent about this and quite ambiguous about what this would mean. And I think that's because he was sort of trapped within this certain vision of British political economy, the British state, that was dependent on empire, was dependent on capital flows, and that this helps explain a little bit sort of what's missing in the general theory, or what is kind of, one of the reasons that kind of Keynesianism and the post-war consensus doesn't really last very long, maybe. So, yeah. Oh, yeah.
How do you interpret the review of your book in the Economist?
Say that again?
Yeah, if people could stand up when they ask a question, that would be great. It's much easier to hear. Thank you.
How do you interpret the review of your book that's in the Economist?
Yeah, so The Economist was good enough to review my book. They actually gave it to someone outside of The Economist, a fellow of all souls, who produced the most economisty review of my book about The Economist you could possibly imagine. Yeah, I thought it was kind of cool. It was obviously a bit snide. They didn't really appreciate what I brought to the table here, even though, I've been in a relationship with The Economist for 8 years, and it was a little bit like someone breaking up with you via text message or something. It felt like they could have worked a bit harder to understand the argument. On the other hand, it did make me feel as though I had won the argument with them, because they did not refute a single thing that I said. They sort of say, well, Zevin says that the famine in Ireland was on par with some of the better known holocausts of the 20th century. Okay, okay, a million Irish men, women, and children died, and a million more emigrated. Yeah, okay, and they kind of go through that, and so I was not in the end offended, but I thought they could have done better.
We had another question.
I mean, you touched on just earlier on, particularly with the kind of food trucks, shilling bread, possible bread, things like that. There's kind of a need to appeal to a younger audience. And the thing I've noticed in the time that I've read The Economist is kind of a tonal creep, where things used to be just bone dry and kind of almost kind of astonishingly correct. The puns are now more overt. The covers are not just kind of neat sort of visual swapsies. They're like caricatures, like the Spectator used to be. And given how much they're prepared to go tonally, do you think there's a chance they could do similarly ideologically?
What do you mean by, what would be the equivalent of that tonal shift in terms of ideology?
Moving towards, that's the question I'm asking you. Look, to probably push back over that Keynesian line. I think that's how it's pronounced. Keynesian, yes. Keynesian line. To something that is more, not necessarily small government, but a more kind of full-throated embrace of, subsidies and things like that.
Like a Green New Deal type of thing?
Yeah, that's a good place, yeah. So.
Oh yeah, okay. So I think that actually is a really good question about the sort of financial press in general, and I was going to ask you, Adam, what you thought about kind of these commentators who have argued that we need to spend more, but then when Labour released its manifesto, I talked about Martin Wolf and the FT, but when Labour released its manifesto, it was like, this is totalitarianism. So I think that what I notice in The Economist's coverage is an awareness that liberalism has a problem and that capitalism has a problem, that something needs to be done about it. They no longer deny that income inequality has risen to dangerously high levels, although they did actually just run a piece that sort of somehow implied that the inequality measurements are inaccurate or something. It was not very convincing. But in general, there's a sense that there is a problem and that something needs to be done about it. And that is a sort of a change from the kind of 1990s and 2000s when it was, absolutely gung-ho, I'm trying to think of it, but anyway, yeah, so that is a difference. There's a kind of self-awareness. But what have they concretely proposed to do about it? Very, very little. I mean, that is what strikes me about our current moment. There's a sort of sense among even self-professed liberals that something must be done. But then when you say, well, what about universal health care? It's like, well, no, we couldn't possibly do that. That would be a revolution. We might as well, I don't know, defy the laws of gravity. And I think The Economist, there's a similar vibe at The Economist, and I think that I see them trying to shift the terms of the debate. The world is now divided for The Economist, not between rich and poor, let alone along more robust class lines, but open people that are open and people that are closed, right? Either you're for globalization or you're a kind of nationalist and, to be sort of discarded, or the young and the old. That's another version of it. Sort of young people are open, dynamic, and liberal, and old people are kind of these sort of miserly pensioners who need to be sort of have their entitlements ripped away from them. So I think it remains underneath the hood largely the same, I guess, is what I'm saying. And in a way that surprises me, because at other moments in time when liberalism has faced crisis, actually there's a reason for this now that I'm saying it, there has been a willingness to compromise. I do not see this willingness to compromise at the moment.
One of the really fascinating things about Alex's book is he gives you a sense of the politics inside the paper, which is particularly opaque in the case of The Economist, because it's all anonymous, or the vast majority of it's anonymous. So if you're an assiduous reader of the New York Times or the FT or Washington Post or whatever, you gain a sense of the political ecology of the newspaper by the fact that the articles have bylines and you can identify who the players are and you can figure out what the distinctions are. One of the peculiar properties of The Economist is that it's incredibly difficult to track that, because you just don't know who wrote what. And so I was trying to think to myself, right, on the Eurozone right now, the acid test is, are they giving Germany a hard time over its fiscal policy? And you could, I can tell you exactly what the position of the New York Times, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post is on that question. But I can't actually recall the killer essay in The Economist that made the argument one way or the other. And I think it's because I can't put a name to the piece. And so there's a really, where did that anonymity element come from? Where did the burying of the politics? Because you tell the story through the editors. I think you're mainly telling the story through the editorials as well, is my sense. Which I don't know what you do, but I never read them, ever, as a point. Because they always drive me crazy. Because I think that the other way of reading The Economist is just to read the stuff at the back, which is full of interesting data and doesn't make you want to kill yourself. How did this politics of control arise, this anonymity?
Yeah, well, it was quite common in Victorian newspapers in the 19th century to have no bylines. So the Times of London had no bylines. It's just that The Economist has retained that for reasons that precisely to do with what we've been talking about. The kind of force of their convictions are so much more convincing when they come from this disembodied sort of collective voice. Now, there's also something funny about that, because a newspaper that advocates free markets and rampant individualism is actually the product of a collective endeavor of some self-sacrifice, where you don't get to have your shiny byline attached to your name, right? So again, Polanyi. But the Economist retains that voice, and it's a good point that it makes it harder to ascribe a kind of opinions to individual people. But I would just say that I agree that the back of that's the way to go. If you're not writing a book on The Economist, definitely just go to the back, because The Economist, one of its good qualities, the reason it's worth writing about, is because it maintains over 20 foreign bureaus all throughout the world. And in contrast to many newspapers in the United States and in Britain, which have radically downsized their foreign coverage, you can learn something. You have to sort of have your ideological kind of radar on, when you're being told that 3 reforms are absolutely necessary tomorrow for,
Pakistani elementary education.
Right.
Which should be privatized, by the way.
Right. When you learn at the end of one of those news pieces that Adam is talking about, you learn that the solution is to privatize the whole education system. Okay, maybe you sort of take a step back, but you do learn things from it, and sometimes it's I certainly do. So yeah.
Okay. I have a question about, you mentioned the sort of decline in The Economist's predictive capacities, and I wondered how much it's actually a reflection of its decreasing ideological sway, and whether there's a sort of paradox that the more the world comes to resemble what The Economist is looking for, the less influence it actually has to shape it. or lag behind ideologically and creatively?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you've partly answered it for me, which I appreciate. Yeah, I think that there have been moments where The Economist has been weak at predicting what comes next. This might be one of them, and the last time, which might be interesting to people because The Economist by the mid '80s and early '90s is so on board the Thatcher, Blair, neoliberal bandwagon. It's hard to really know, unless you read my book, that they were late to they were actually quite late to parts of the neoliberal project, in particular monetarism, and these ideas that Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys promoted. There are all sorts of reasons for that, but I think one of them is because The Economist, being deeply embedded in kind of Atlantic state structures, the US and Britain, saw full employment as a kind of necessary condition of fighting the Cold War. That the ideological struggle with Soviet communism required the West to live up in some form to its ideals, and to have a kind of totally dissatisfied, working class would damage that project. So they don't, I mean, this is somewhat simplistic, but they don't actually like Friedman, and they have fights with Friedman. The economics editor of The Economist in the 80s had fights with Friedman, so they're kind of behind the curve, right? And so that's another example, maybe another moment where they didn't quite see what was coming. They eventually scamper on board, but they are a little bit late, and I think you might be right about why it is that they're not so effective at the moment at sort of predicting or seeing what comes next.
I have two questions. One, why is it called a newspaper and not a magazine? And two, you get this kind of early part of the book that Marx, who's living in London at the time, very much takes notice of what The Economist is, what they're thinking. Does it go the other way? Does The Economist ever take notice of Marx or Engels, or is it only later when there's one more organized socialist political movement that they start to care?
Right, okay, so why does it still call itself a newspaper? Because when it first came out, it was in newspaper form. It had a nice Gothic letterhead, very difficult to read. I mean, really, it's a challenge, If you go back into the archive, it's very difficult, very, very condensed text, but I plowed through. And as for Marx, I was looking for this. I was looking for this because some of the things that Marx says and some of the things that the second editor, Bagehot, says are so remarkably similar.
The line about where Bagehot says the cabinet government is like a board of directors.
Yeah, it's astounding. It's like Bagehot is Marx through a funhouse mirror or something. They're both seeing the same thing, but one thinks it's awesome, and the other thinks it's sinister and deserves to be, destroyed. And that's a great example. Marx famously says that the executive of the state is this is the executive committee of bourgeoisie, and Bagehot says something similar. So I was unable to find an instance of Bagehot reading Marx, which is what I wanted to find. And of course, The Economist does become aware of Marxism as a movement and as an ideology, but quite a bit later, and they're not as interested as they should be in this phenomenon.
I'm not a reader of The Economist, so this is an honest question, and maybe you've answered it in part already. But do they see this nativist, nationalist, protectionist turn as a ruse of history that the globalist view will overcome, or do they want to contend with it seriously as a world historical antagonist? And here's the twist of the question. I want to know what you three think.
So I think. Okay, so I'll start, and then I'll take a breather and allow Tusa and Adam to talk. But I think they do take it seriously. I don't think they began by taking it seriously. And if you look at the editorials and news articles on Trump, there's just an absolute disdain for him as this buffoon and clown. And there's no real sense that he's going to capture the Republican nomination, let alone be president. So I think, no, that's at first. But, after Trump and Brexit, remember these happened in the same within months of each other, Trump's elected and Brexit happens, I think there's a sense that, okay, we actually do need to confront this as a world historical problem. I think that the thing that I find strange and damaging, although, well, not strange, but damaging, is this kind of conflation of opponents of a version of globalization promoted by The Economist of left and right? That the enemy of two extremes. The Economist still seems to think that Sanders is the same as Bannon or something, and that Corbyn is actually a bit worse than Farage. And you don't have to look too far into the past to see where that version of liberalism gets you, I think. So that's sort of my attempt at a reply.
I don't read all of The Economist. I tend to follow the way that magazines talk about immigration more broadly, and I think that when it comes to migration, they're still very bullish on that, and they do think that that's a good thing and that it will prevail because there's no other feasible way for the world to keep turning. So on that specifically, I think that they think the globalists will win.
I mean, I think I read it pretty closely, and I've been very struck by the pessimism, not just of their commentary about Trump, but about America in general. I mean, it's a pretty bleak diagnosis of a place broken in multiple different ways. The Economist line on climate change is increasingly serious-minded, and they are, as you would expect, scathing about the Republican Party. They address themselves to the Republicans, first and foremost, and ask, where is the Republican Party? How could it be that the voice that supposedly represents American business could be so blind to the long-term risks that are piling up there? There was a remarkable long report last year or the year before on the Trump phenomenon directly, which I thought was astonishing in its sort of political science cynicism, in the sense that it described democratic voting as an exercise in incredibly limited information and limited rationality in terms of tribalism, described the incredibly limited possibilities for any real shift in opinion in the US. So it was a remarkably dark and bleak assessment, I thought, that was very unsparing about the actual operation. But it's not, but then on the other hand, two other things that really struck me have been their reporting on, they focus very tightly on cities. They understand, and I think you described this, Economist journalists in the US are expected not just to report on Washington and New York. They are expected to report on the United States as a whole. And so they've been running remarkably fierce commentary on Baltimore, even at the point when President Trump had singled it out and victimized Baltimore. But there was an unsparing account of violence in both Baltimore and Chicago. And the other campaign, which I do think is a campaign, is their hard-hitting and cynical commentary on California. So I think their kind of splitting the difference is not simply they can't tell the difference between Sanders and Bannon. They're also describing the dysfunction of California as a microcosm, and particularly San Francisco, as a microcosm of the kind of NIMBYist dysfunction. And again, of course, it's a great example, immediately accessible to a Hayekian kind of critique, in which NIMBYist, highly privileged, deeply entrenched left Democrats exclude, the population that would actually need low-cost housing built, and so The Economist has an absolutely pat explanation of the homelessness crisis and some astonishing graphics of public defecation in San Francisco that drive home this point. So I take their commentary to be very hard-hitting about the US, very pessimistic about its long-run prospects, and really quite precise in the kind of malfunctions that they diagnose. I do agree that tech is somehow lurking in the background, but they are certainly not boosters of California.
Well, neither is President Trump, so maybe they have something in common on that point. I was just going to just say, to push back slightly, which is, yes, there is now pessimism about the US, but what is also striking is that in the run-up to Trump's election, they were saying nothing is fundamentally wrong. People have indoor toilets. didn't have that half a century ago. Be happy, vote for Hillary. You know, it was like an astoundingly complacent.
Well, America does have it.
Well, okay, well there you go. But it was what I mean is that it was quite complacent about sort of the gains that capitalism had given Americans, and that America was a less racist place than it used to be. It was a more prosperous place than it used to be. Why is this hateful vision of that promoted by Trump, doing as well as it is? Vote against Trump, and sort of so to me it was quite blind. The other thing I would just say is that what is interesting to me in part is that despite the fact that the war, and this is consistent among all the editors, despite the fact that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the other engagements by the West throughout the world in the period since the end of the Cold War, let's say, have not gone terribly well. Okay, let's say since 2001, have not gone terribly well. The Economist is aware of that, its editors are aware of that, haven't quite issued a mea culpa for their call on Iraq, but at the end of the day, the US is the world's policeman. They do not see an alternative, and so there's a funny way in which no matter the pessimism, no matter how bad things get, no matter whether the US is or isn't right in its interventions, and for The Economist, Obama showed a distinct lack of will in not, outright invading Syria, or in not bombing Libya enough. Despite all of that, it's sort of more of the same. It seems inescapable. To me, that's almost a kind of pathology. And so I would just say that, yes, I agree with you. They are quite hard-hitting now sometimes in their reporting, especially, more than their editorials. But there's this kind of inescapable quality to American power that just kind of moots the critique they can offer or the distance they can take. That's all.
Maybe just one more.
You've been, all three of you have been describing The Economist as kind of being adrift in the current moment historically, and in terms of its unwillingness to kind of dig in ideologically and self-analyze and maybe make some changes. And I'm just curious if there are any publications you see now that you would describe as liberal that are actually doing that kind of work of self-analysis and trying to figure out what needs to be changed on a fundamental structural level.
Yeah, there's a great magazine called The New Left Review. I have no connection to it, but it does offer some of the most sort of hard-hitting and deep analysis of the present conjuncture and the current crises, which are multiple of capitalism. I would say that I actually am curious to hear what Atusa would say. I would just say that one example of a publication that is quintessentially liberal historically is The New Republic. And, it has actually changed quite a bit in the last few years, and it's quite astounding to me some of the things I read in The New Republic now, people that they brought in to write editorials or to write long think pieces, and so I think that there is, again, there are different versions of liberalism. Maybe The New Republic version is kind of a more successful example of liberals kind of grappling with the crises of the moment, whereas The Economist has, in my view, been less incisive.
The New Republic also has had 6 different owners in the past 4 years, so I think that's more a function of the business model than but certainly it's changed its tune. So your question was, have any liberal, in the way that Alex is defining it, liberal papers or magazines grappled with the...
If there are any ones that you think have been grappling with it particularly well, because obviously a lot more, so...
In a sort of cohesive editorial way, no. I think the way that publications deal with that is they bring in new writers who have maybe a different view or a more progressive view or a more conservative view, and they cope with it that way, sort of through attrition. I really can't. I guess The New Republic is a pretty good example, again, because of complete overhaul of staff and leadership. But yeah, I can't think of a complete turn or a real reckoning.
Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue.
Teen Vogue, absolutely. That's a great example.
I didn't know you were asking about liberal magazines at first. I just that's why I said about the new, not a liberal magazine, obviously. So just.
I just have a sort of novice American-centered question about The Economist, because I'm not as familiar and I'm listening to what you're saying, and I was about the influence it had this very small readership, and am I right in interpreting it that they sort of were the mouthpiece, were they either the mouthpiece of a group of policymakers that are way hidden behind the scene, or are they consensus makers who actually influence policy? Because my experience of how policy and media work in this country is that defense contractors or industry funds think tanks like Project for New American Century, and then those people then get a mole like Judith Miller of the New York Times to enact a theater in front of us that, so that the policy's not starting with the magazine or the newspaper at all. And it sounds like what you're saying is that actual policy got made and it came in a form through, not through corporate funded think tanks, but through academia. Am I wrong?
Well, The Economist does, mine academic journals and think tanks, and they're good at kind of, I think, connecting themselves to a variety of kind of, points of production of ideas. I think that at different periods in its existence, it's had different orientations towards that stuff, so that sometimes The Economist is actually at the forefront of crafting policy itself, and that its editors are actually on the committees, that sit in Parliament, or giving testimony to Congress about the reforms that need to be implemented in monetary policy, and that's the way it works. Today, I think it's more what you're describing, that they are kind of connected to, embedded in these networks, and then sort of give us the sort of digestible version of those things. I don't know if you guys think differently, but yeah. Should we?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, enjoy it.
Okay, thank you, Adam, Alex, Matusa. A couple of closing things. Firstly, Alex's book is for sale, and it's a brilliant Christmas gift, even Christmas-themed cover, good for your liberal and non-liberal friends and family. Please do buy a copy on your way out. Secondly, we have some food and some drinks available. Please feel welcome to spend some time here now. Ask Alex about his new book project, and okay. Good night. Thank you.